Hello everybody, welcome to another Transformative Teachers webinar. It's so wonderful to have you with us. So today, before we start, I would like to just remind you of the upcoming Future of English Language Teaching conference, which is in just over 3 weeks' time. It's on Saturday, the 10th of June, and it's online, and it's a whole day of sessions like the one that Ian will be doing today, and like the ones that we have at all of the Transformative Teachers webinars. So if you would like to come along for a day of fascinating, inspiring sessions, then please do book your place. You can use the QR code that's on the screen, or you can follow the links or find the web page. Also check your emails, because emails will be sent to you to remind you with links in there so that you can sign up to it. And then at the end of the webinar today, I will share this screen again in case you want to look at the details some more. Okay, so for the webinar today, this session will last for an hour as usual. We are recording the session. In the recording, it will just be myself and Ian and all of the slides that you can see. So exactly as you see it now, you will see it in the recording. So please check your emails, because once the recording has been uploaded to the Trinity website, you will be able to watch it again. So don't worry, if you miss anything that Ian says today, you'll find it all recorded. So you should be able to see myself and Ian, but your microphones and your cameras are off. But please do participate via the chat box. We love all of the messages that come through the chat, and I know that Ian will be asking you some questions and inviting you to participate, so you can use the chat box. You can also use the Q&A box if a particular question comes to your mind, and we will try to answer as many of the questions as we can throughout the session. So if something comes to you, please put it straight in the Q&A box. Or if you think it's something which other attendees might be able to answer, maybe you want suggestions on a particular website, for example, you could put it in the chat, and then maybe other attendees will answer your question for you. Okay, so I can see already that people are joining us from all corners of the earth. We've got Lima, Peru, Argentina, Myanmar, Vietnam, Italy, India, Bangladesh, Romania, Scotland, much nearer to where Ian and I are. I'm in England, Ian's in Ireland. So welcome wherever you're joining us from. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce today's topic. So today's subject is such an important one. It's something which is not only rarely covered, but it's actually something which is rarely even thought about. It's a topic that's really at the center of what we do, and yet we don't even think about it because it's such a background for us many times. But Ian is here to talk about it. So Ian is the director of the Linguaviva Centre in Ireland, which is the oldest English language school in Dublin, I believe. He works with Trinity as a CERT TESOL tutor. But essential for today's purposes, he is a schools inspector with equals. Is that how you say it, Ian? Equals.
Yeah.
Equals. I'm making it too complicated.
The A is silent.
Yeah. And QQI in Ireland, which are two of the bodies which accredit the Trinity exams. So Ian is grounded in assessment, and that's what he'll be talking to us about today. So Ian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Thank you. Actually, you didn't mention probably my most important role, my original role, which is as a teacher. I still teach a lot, and I think it's crucially important for this particular topic, because it's teachers who run tests, it's teachers who see the effects of tests. So yes, at one level, academic teams are putting together tests, but they don't actually see what happens on the ground. So this session is partly for teachers, but partly also for institutions that are testing students. So I want to begin by looking at the effects, if we do testing, the effects that tests have on our students, on our teachers as well, and on our institutions. And I want to look at, as a student goes through their journey of learning English, at what points they're tested and how relevant those tests are, and what, again, the feedback, the effect of those tests are on the student. For example, do they learn from tests? I think is a very important issue that we have to focus on today. We need to look at the learner's needs. What do they need it for? Sometimes you need a test for something very quickly and you're very happy to get those results very quickly. Sometimes it's a longer journey, like learning English, for example. And there are things that can help us. Hopefully the curriculum in your school can help you. The CEFR, so the way that CEFR tells us about students' levels and how they move through those levels as they progress with English, I think that's going to be a very useful tool for our listeners. We're going to look at institutions like Trinity and like Oxford, like Cambridge, who put together tests and look at how difficult that is and how long a process it is. And then look back into the classroom, at my own classroom, and some tests that I devised, and the thinking behind those tests, trying to make them as formative as possible. Okay, so I want us to think first of all about a driving test, just as an example of a test which a lot of us will have endured. There's a motivational speaker called Simon Sinek, and he has an interesting idea, which is that no matter what decision you make, when you're making decisions, whether it's a really good decision or a really bad decision, it's going to have some negative potential consequences and some positive potential consequences. Any test that we devise has potentially got some negative consequences and some positive. So I want us to think about our driving test. What were the good things maybe about a driving test, and maybe the not so great things about a driving test? If you could put some ideas into the chat box, that would really be helpful. I remember when I did my own driving test, there were actually two driving inspectors, one sitting in the back and one sitting beside me, because I think the inspector was being inspected himself. But having two in the car with sunglasses, was intimidating.
Intimidating.
Yeah.
Do you know, my first driving test, I was so nervous, I hit the first corner, and that was the end of the test.
My God.
Let's see. So in the chat box, we've got, on the one hand, gain confidence, and on the other, it was traumatic. It was terrible. Oh, someone had to complain about the supervisors. Gosh, these are things that I was, yeah, extra things that can happen.
You're more focused on getting around that first corner, yeah.
It was very stressful, someone says, but at the end of it, I gained confidence. So confidence has come up a few times.
Right.
They seem to either be really terrible and traumatizing and horrific, or confidence gaining are the two main themes here, Ian.
Great. Okay. So I think when you think about driving tests, most people have that feeling that, it was very traumatic, because it's, it's a short test that happens on a particular day at a particular time. And you can feel very nervous before it and during it. You also have to do it exactly within the perimeters of what they say. So it's not, can you drive? It's, can you drive as we taught you, and do the things. For example, be seen to be looking in the mirrors it's not just look in the mirrors, but it's be seen to be looking in the mirrors. You need to know the theory, you need to know the practice. It's a very practical test on the positive side, and there's very transparent, and as you discovered, Lucy, very immediate feedback, which is usually a good thing, because once you pass your test, you can actually drive home if you got your car with you. So there are positives and there are negatives to driving tests, although most of us have a traumatic story to tell because we were so nervous. So that's something we should learn in terms of our students. Every student who goes to a test feels an emotional either a positive or negative because you're doing this test. I've heard of schools where students actually don't go in on the test day because they know it's going to be on that day, and they kind of avoid, their progress being tested, but also they avoid the experience of the test.
So would that be on say on a weekly basis? Say the test is every Friday, they might miss that part of the class every Friday to avoid that test.
Anecdotally, I've been in meetings where schools are talking about, having say 50% attendance on the test days. So they're obviously doing something wrong.
That's a real shame, isn't it? Because they're not high stakes tests. If these are weekly progress tests, you think of them as being just helpful for the students to know their progress. So if they feel that nervous,
that gives us a little window into testing and the effects of testing. So if those tests were formative, if they were helping them to learn, I don't think that they'd be missing them in those numbers. I think it's because they don't see them as that. They don't see the feedback. They see the going through that experience of an hour of, maybe a quite a closed item test where they don't get feedback quickly, so it's a little bit in that case like the driving test, isn't it, where they feel nervous and they just feel like they're going to get a negative outcome because maybe they did miss some of the input during the week or didn't understand it.
So it sounds like they feel like they're just very passive in this process rather than active. Something is being done to them rather than them having a learning opportunity.
True. And if you think about who's responsible for that, I think you come down to, who's responsible for progress within an institution. In my opinion, both the institution itself, but also the learner has responsibility. And that's where we as teachers and institutions, we need to make the test as positive an experience as possible. And the learner, I suppose, has to understand that testing is part of life. It's also important that they feel like they're making progress. So that it's that progress part they have to feel like they're making. So just to contrast with that, we do the Trinity Cert TESOL for, that's basically a 5-week course where teachers learn to teach the communicative language teaching method. And the interesting thing about that is they're being tested almost daily. Sometimes that's in a practical way where they're doing teaching practice. Sometimes it's in a more, say, in a written form where they're doing assignments. And sometimes it's in little quizzes and little activities they might be doing during the day. But I suppose what I like about that is it's continual. It doesn't happen on a particular Friday at 9 o'clock where, suddenly they're feeling nervous about, I have to take this test. Everything depends on it. I remember as an 18-year-old going to the state exams and literally feeling that my whole future depended on this next, few hours, which is a terrible weight to feel. It's got nothing to do with your knowledge or your ability to pass the test. It's actually a barrier, isn't it? So they're the kind of barriers we need to think about. So one form of improving the experience is making it continual. Although some people will disagree with me on that, having tests all the time is not for everybody, but I do think it's fairer overall. Little tests, big tests, and a variety being the most important thing.
And I suppose it depends if you're redefining what a test is, then having regular continual testing is not such a terrible thing.
Exactly. It's not so high stakes. Exactly. Okay, so just 1 second. Yes. So I just want to show you the journey of a student in our school. On the top right there, you can see that we have, because our students come to us in an intensive format, they might come, the average student comes for about 3 to 4 weeks, but we have a lot of students who might stay a year as well. So for those ones who are staying medium term, like a year, they want to know how much English will I know when I leave the school. So what we say to them is roughly between 8 and 12 weeks gives you the input for one level of the CEFR. So we divide the levels up into 6, and we talk about the journey from beginner to advanced, taking approximately with us 1 year. And so the reason we say 8 to 12 weeks, and this is very important, is that not every learner is the same. every learner has their own journey in terms of progress. And sometimes when we put learners into a classroom, we think of them as one profile. But every learner who's learning a language has a jagged profile. They might be very good at speaking, but not so good at writing, etc. They might be good at grammar, but not good at vocabulary. So it's important as teachers that we treat people as individuals, but it's also important as an institution that we don't let them not make progress. In other words, that comes a point when they need to make progress, because if they don't get new input at a higher level, they're never really going to progress. I remember sorry, Lucy, I remember as a manager going into a school and asking a student, you know, what level are you? And they said A2, and I said A2 is an elementary level. And I said, you know, well, how long have you been in Ireland? And they said 2 years. And I said, that's not possible. You couldn't be here for 2 years at the second level of English. And they said, no, that's what I am. I am that level. So they just identified with that. They didn't think they could make any progress. So in that situation, I think the institution is responsible, but also, of course, the student has a responsibility to progress, you know. So it's a two-way thing.
People are asking in the chat, how many lessons do your students take, or how many hours a week do they get? Because
thank you, Peter. Exactly. So what we're saying there, 8 to 12 weeks, they get 120 to 180 hours of input. So 180 hours of tuition. In my school, what we say to them is, you must be ready to move up then. So what does that mean? So the fast students, after 8 weeks, they're already moving up. The ones who are, so let's say the standard students, are moving up around week 10, 11. When they get to 12, it's up to the institution to have given them the remedial help to help them to pass the level test.
So does that mean they're attending roughly like 20 hours or so a week? Exactly. They're full-time?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's called intensive, but it's, you know, it's debatable. We have other students who are doing sort of 25, 30 hours.
Okay.
These students are what we call standard. They're doing a standard course. About 180 hours is when we expect them to be at the next level. So we take on the responsibility. We guarantee they're going to move up. The only way we can do that is by, at week 8, talking to them and saying, you've done the test, these are the outcomes, these are the areas you need to improve. So we'll give you tutorials, but you have to do the work to improve. So it's the job of the institution is to highlight the problem and show some solutions. But then from the student's point of view, obviously, ultimately, they're the ones learning English.
So do these students have extra like one-to-one sessions to help to guide them?
What we do is like 10, 15-minute tutorials to help you with the thing that you're finding difficult in the test. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then the other thing I would say, if you go to extensive schools, I used to teach in Spain for 5 years, for example. In an extensive school, you're probably talking about that 3 months being a year, an academic year. So again, it's very important that year on year students are moving up. So it's beholden on the institution not to start testing at the end of the course, because that could be too late for the student to make sure they move to the next level. So really, maybe from Christmas, you need to be, or from mid-course, I mean, you need to be, you know, testing and giving some tutorials to help the student to be ready to pass the test. So that's a similar version of the extensive model. The other thing I would question is, when do we test? So in an open enrollment system like we have in our school, students are arriving every week. So their course is different to the courses of students who arrive in other weeks. So we have to treat them as individuals, and we have to decide when is the opportune time for them to test them. If you're in an academic year program and students are progressing at the same rate, well, I can see more reason to have a midterm test because everybody is doing midterm at that moment. But in our school, that doesn't work because everybody has their own journey. So what I'm saying is we need to treat the students as individuals and be sure we know when is the appropriate moment. Sorry, I skipped a slide I wanted to show. So at the back of this slide is very busy, I apologize. But at the back of the slide, you have our brochure, our lovely brochure, which is showing the touch points for the students When do we come in contact with the students? Well, for example, when they're choosing their course, when they do a placement test to say which class they're going to study in, when they get a certificate at the end of the course, etc. So if you read from the left to the right, I'd ask a few questions of the institution. For example, if you're doing a placement test, how standardized is that? In other words, if Lucy does the test or if Ian does the test, will they get the same questions? And crucially, will we expect the same answers? So I think institutions, schools should script the questions and script what they expect the answers to be. In other words, if you think that this student is a B1 level student, what did they show to say that they're a B1 level student? So we need to know what we expect at each of the different levels. If you do an external exam like IELTS, for example, the examiner can only ask you certain questions. The exam is scripted, and the reason for that is they want it to be standardized. So I think there's a certain amount of standardization we should take. I inspect schools around Europe. Sometimes I find that it's actually administrative staff that are doing the tests. The problem with that is they're probably more organized in terms of the administration, but they're not teachers. So do they know what they expect at a B1 level or a A2 level or a C1 level? So I think there needs to be an academic standardization of the people doing the tests. So what we're talking about here is a placement test within an institution. In my opinion, a teacher is not equipped to do that kind of test. A teacher is able to test within the level that they're working with. So in other words, if I do tests in my class, I can say how Peter is performing within my class with the B1 outcomes, for example. But I can't really tell you, is he an A2 or a C1 level student without some type of rubric that I can use to check that. In other words, if I'm a teacher, unless I have special training, I'm not an assessor. So I think personally that an academic team should do the assessment, and then within the class, the teacher should do the progress testing. So I would always separate progress testing from level testing, which is usually either on an institutional level or on an external level. Great, so the next touch point I would mention after that then is the first day experience. So as I said about every decision or everything that happens, there's a good and a bad side. With the pandemic, the good side was that we went online, that nowadays students coming to schools in Dublin or in London, they can do the testing before they arrive. It's very important that your test tests what you expect the student, the skills you expect them to have on the course. So if it's a communicative language course, they should have in their test an oral interview. We know this since the 80s when communicative language teaching started. It's anathema now to think of a language test that doesn't have an oral component, thankfully. So if someone is coming to do a language course, they should have an oral language test before that. Usually they would have some sort of online placement test as well, which would include grammar, vocabulary, maybe some writing. That's very well, that's great, but it's very, very important, I think, that they have that speaking component, because if you come to Linguaviva or a school like this, most of the work will be done through speaking. So that's very important. The next point that we maybe might test them is, as we mentioned, for progress testing. So the next thing I would say to you is, if your class is full of interaction, full of skills work, why would you put on a test that is, grammar-based, vocabulary-based, single item test, that is really just recycling what you did during the week? So in other words, are you testing the skills that you taught during the week? I think that's a really important question for the teacher, but even more for the institution. What tests do you expect your teachers to administer in the classes? In my opinion, if it's a skills-based course, it should be a skills-based test. If speaking is the #1 skill in your class, speaking should be the #1 skill in the testing.
Ian, there's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. I'm not sure if this is the best moment to ask them, but I don't want to forget them.
Yes.
A couple of people have asked about the skills, the learning skills that the students come with. So it may be that the students, for example, refugees are mentioned here, that maybe have poor literacy, or it may be that the students are not used to learning independently, and so they struggle to make the progress without quite a lot of guidance. So
Yes.
how do you manage all of that?
This very much depends on the kind of institution you work in. So I work in a private language school. And so most of the students are coming from an academic background. So everybody has learned English at some point in their life, usually in secondary school, some of them in both primary and secondary. As you know, in Europe, because we get, say, 50% of the students are European, in Europe, there's been a big push over the last 20 years since the CEFR came out for people to leave their school system with roughly a B2 level of English. So we would get a lot of students who are just hitting that level, but maybe a little bit weak because that's why they want to come and do a bit more with us. But B1, B2 level would be the typical levels for our students. Now, we would have A0, A1, A2 level students as well. They tend to come from further afield. You could almost say the further away from here, the less English they tend to have. And then you're getting into problems like you're talking about, which are, the hardest, as we all know from learning a language, the hardest few months of learning a language are those initial ones, the first 3 months and then the second 3 months. So my advice to language students coming to England and Ireland would be to do that work before they arrive, to arrive at an A2, ideally, their progress is going to be exponential from there. But just going back to those problems, because obviously you come across dyslexia, illiteracy, etc., various problems like that. You also come, as you said, you come across people who haven't got training of, or maybe they haven't been a student for years. So there's a lot of things that the institution and the teacher need to deal with. But I suppose we're fairly lucky within our kind of teaching that we don't have a lot of literacy problems. I do think, though, nowadays that the course books are very well able to deal with, for example, if you have students with dyslexia problems, a course book like English File or Headway, they'll give you options of how to help your dyslexic students. So, it's quite broad in terms of the courses that we do. But literacy, I would say, is almost, another issue.
Right. And it seems that what you're saying with your school is that because your school has a lot of communicative activities, then it makes sense to do the testing in that kind of way, because that fits with what you're teaching. So I suppose if schools are teaching in very different ways because they have a different demographic of students, they need to think, how can they assess those students appropriately for their learning styles? And
what I'm really saying is, does the test what it's meant to? Because I absolutely do think, I remember, for example, in school, we had spelling tests, and now I feel extremely well able to spell, but it's only because I was given that work when I was a young child, because English spelling isn't phonetic, so you need to focus in on how words are spelled. So absolutely, there's a place for all different types of tuition, but your test should test what you're teaching. I'm not saying your course has to be communicative.
Right.
Class needs to test what you're teaching.
Right. So you're not advocating a particular kind of way of testing. It's just for us, for everybody to think, how do we test in our centre, and does that match what we do with our students?
In a nutshell, does it match? In other words, going back to that bad experience of students avoiding the test, why are they avoiding the test? Because it's not like the rest of the week. It's the down part of the week for them.
Right.
The other thing then is it fair? In other words, if I do a placement test that's a grammar test, and then I put somebody into a level because of that, but it turns out that their speaking is much better, is that a fair placement? No, it's not. So you need to think, what are they going to use this for? And the interesting thing about that is, if you look at something like the CEFR that describes a language learner, It describes a language learner as a social agent in real life situations beyond the classroom. So are we testing things that are beyond the classroom? In other words, the skills that they're learning in our community language classrooms are meant to help them beyond the classroom. So again, do we test those things? I think sometimes we fall short in those areas. And the final thing I've mentioned briefly is I think there should be a way, if your test says that the student has problems, that you are able to help them. So by law in Ireland, if you have a private language school, you have to have a remedial route for students. In other words, they have to have some way of being able to improve if their test is weak. I think that's a really good thing.
Very important.
Very important, yeah. So we actually looked at that slide first. So I want to look at the learner. I've given you a very, if this learner walked in my door, I think I'd be a bit worried. He looks a bit serious. And so basically what I want to do is I want to talk about whether it's the learner's responsibility or the school's responsibility for that progress. And we already talked a little bit about there are points where the school is going to interact with the student to make sure that the journey is going well. And at those points, that's when we have to give them some feedback and we have to be able to help them. So a few years ago, I went to study Italian. I went to study Italian in Tuscany. It was a really nice place to study, but I was like an A2 level, a low level Italian speaker at the time. And so I had a teacher who on the Friday when there was a test would always take us out for a little tutorial and give us some feedback on how we were doing. And personally, I found that very motivating. I thought, oh, this is really good because it linked for me how I did last week with this week. Was I still on course? It gave me confidence because I wasn't a strong speaker. And it was in Italian, which was nice because I was practicing as I got the feedback. So that's the kind of positive washback that testing can have if you are thinking of tests in a formative way. A few years ago, I used to work for a school that was in this organization called Equals, the European Association of Quality Language Schools. And they came up with an idea which is called a certificate of achievement. So some of us might feel, oh, our students only coming for 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. We don't have time. We don't have time to test them in a thorough way. So a school like ours, most schools like ours, they give certificates of attendance. Okay, so you attended a course for 3 weeks at such and such a level, but it doesn't talk about your progress at all. What we discovered in Equals was you have plenty of opportunities to actually give them a certificate of achievement if our learning system includes progressive tests where we can say, yes, you've made the progress from here to here within that 2 or 3 weeks. A student who's only in our school 1 week, we still have 20 hours to test them. It's a lot of hours if we do it right. What I'm saying really is a teacher could be doing a communicative activity during the class and at the same time be looking at individuals in terms of certain criteria for speaking, for example. What's their fluency like? What's their accuracy like? What's their range and control like? Etc. So once you have those little rubrics that the teachers can use, it makes it a lot easier to test as you go along. Now, I'm not advocating testing while you're teaching all the time. There's too much going on, but it is possible. If you did have a client that wanted to be tested for a certificate of achievement, I think there are plenty of opportunities as long as we're organized. So I want to ask the participants, do they think that the teacher should be responsible for level testing? So you get students in your class and you're told or you presume that they're a certain level. To what extent should the teacher be responsible for that level testing? Both in the systems like ours, which are intensive systems, or in the extensive system where you're maybe studying for a year in a school.
So would that be the teacher deciding when the student might be ready to move up a level, for example, or just deciding if they're in the correct level and they should go down?
So within our system, there comes a point where each individual may be ready to move up. do we ask the teacher about that, or do we find out independently? But also in an extensive system, should the teacher be responsible for progress, or actually for that level change, that level moving?
Interesting.
Yeah, it's treated differently in different schools. That's what I want to get at, really.
Right. Okay. So, in the chat, some people say it's an academic job.
Yes.
In one school, the teachers are required by their contract to conduct initial assessments. So it's built
and
into the school
I wonder in
itself.
that school, do they design the tests, or are they using a test that is given to them? It'd be interesting to know.
It's difficult for teachers in a mixed level class to create a test for all.
Absolutely.
But one person says here, yes, definitely they should be responsible for the level move. Or it should be a collaboration here between student, teacher, and academic manager.
Yes, I think that's probably the best. If you can devise a system where you have the three interested parties who are able to talk to each other, I think that's perfect. Of course, the student needs to be involved, because they need to know from that feedback that they're ready. They need to be confident enough. And you do come across students who don't want to move up because they don't feel confident enough. So the teacher and the institution need to give them that confidence. The teacher, of course, is the first point of call. So they know the student better than the institution knows the student. But they, as I said, they are judging the student within the range of the people in that class. They're probably not judging them within the range of the people in the institution or beyond, in terms of the overall level. So to me, an academic team, however that's made up, that could do the level test, and then the teacher in the classroom is working on that progress test within the level, so that when it comes to level testing, on one hand, you have the level test results, you have the teacher's input, and then you have the students' agreement, if you like, that they're ready to move. So there should always be like a framework, but also a frame time-wise in which they can move up within our systems, I think, because I don't think it's okay for a student just to remain at the same level. But of course, in the extensive system, it's different, because there'll be moments where they are expected to move up, whether that be halfway through the course or at the end of the course. But again, the three parties need to be in tune for that to work smoothly.
There has been a question of what you do if maybe there's a student who does get really stuck at a particular level.
Yeah, this is the question I always get, because it's the difficult one for the system I'm talking about. So again, as I said, any decision you make in life is going to have potential positive, potential negative consequences. By far, the more positive consequences here are if you are saying to students, I'm guaranteeing you progress. You're going to make progress because we are interested and you're interested in making that progress. There will be the odd student who is just finding it very hard. All the institution can do there is give them a little bit more attention, help them a little bit more. But ultimately, I would suggest that if you don't move to the next level and get that input at the higher level, you're actually going to progress slower. So you need, somebody like Krashen would say, you need the input at the higher level. You need that +1 to actually improve. So in other words, if I am just keep getting input at A2 level, no matter how good a student I am, I'm never really going to make that progress at B1 level, because I haven't had any of that input, So there is a onus on us to move the students through the level, but you will have, and you'll have teachers who say, look, I've got this B1 student, he's here because you've moved him up through the levels, but he's really only A2. My counter argument is that every student has a jagged profile. You're judging that student probably because he's not a good speaker, number one, because that's what the number one thing we're looking for. But he may come from a nationality where that's not the thing that's prized in the educational system. It might be a much more kind of written, grammar-based system that they have the English in their head, but they're just not getting the time to practice it. sufficiently. So yes, there are counter arguments. I think overall, it's going to be much more positive if students are moving methodically through the levels. So my kind of metaphor or analogy for this is, do you see that bridge in Venice on the left there, where the institution on the one hand is building the bridge, and on the other hand, it's the teacher and the student who are doing the other part of the work. So what you don't want is an institution that is doing all of the testing, because that leaves out the teacher and sometimes the student, but you do want a cooperation between the two, both sides to take responsibility for this process. For example, I think an institution needs to make those big calls like, for example, should our tests be skills-based, or should they be, testing other things, like you said, learner training, because that's maybe something that's crucial to our system. And whatever it is we're teaching, we should be testing. Does that make sense? The other thing about it is, I think we need empirical evidence. I remember when I started teaching, we used to go, oh yeah, I think that guy's ready to move up. Oh yeah, I feel like he's really good. We used to use those kind of verbs. Whereas nowadays, we know that there are platforms. The one we're involved with is GelNet and guided e-learning, but there are lots and lots of these. But what they do very well is they give us empirical evidence whether a student, for example, has done the tests, what they've scored in the tests, how many activities they've done, what their attendance is. All of these things are important in the overall question of, are they making sufficient progress? So where a student comes and goes, oh, I'm ready to move up my level, I can go and I can look and say, well, actually, you've only done 60% of the activities, that you're meant to do at this level. So you need to go and do at least 20% of that other, half of that other 40%, So in other words, we can move away from the idea of I think or I feel that student is ready. We can actually know when they've passed these markers by how committed they are to the course. Yeah, so I think that's important. The age of the computer has given us that, and with AI, it's going to get better and better in that regard. By the way,
just a quick time check. We've got just under 20 minutes.
Okay, good. What I was going to say was, I'm not a big advocate of AI from the point of view of creating syllabi or curricula or material. It tends to be very kind of boring material. But from the point of view of testing and assessment, it's amazing, because they can do it much quicker than a human. Okay, good. So the other thing I would just mention here is, in terms of empirical knowledge about progress, I think it's very important that schools start giving certification that tells exactly what the learner's journey was. So one of the difficult things about language schools is we call students, for example, in a B1 level class, we call them B1 level language students. They're not actually B1 level, because by definition, they're working towards that outcome. So they're actually, A2 plus level students. So in my opinion, and in the CEFR, each level is a journey. So the initial journey is from A0 to A1, for example, then from A1 to A2. Somebody who's in that A2 class is actually A1 level, and they don't reach A2 until they meet those outcomes. So again, I think as schools, we should be saying this student was on this journey for this number of hours in our institutions. Then we'd be able to invite students into the school and know exactly what they've done before at those particular levels. So we should describe in detail what the language journey of the student was. And nowadays we have the tools to do that. Okay, I want to just talk for a moment, Lucy, about making tests, designing tests. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a big advocate of teachers designing sort of level tests. I think there's too much involved, and that's why Trinity and Oxford and Cambridge and IELTS exist, because they have the resources to do this kind of testing. But if you are interested in designing your own test, you can use this document on the left It's called the CEFR Alignment Handbook. So it'll tell you exactly how your test, your outcomes align with the CEFR. There are databases now, you can put in your outcome and it'll tell you what level your outcomes are. So it's a very thorough guide for how to design a test within your school. However, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't really think that teachers have the time or the resources to do this very thoroughly. So let's look for a moment at testing institutions. So we've got the likes of Trinity, we've got IELTS, Oxford, Cambridge, there are many more. But they go through this rigorous process that takes a long time. So I've put there the criteria, or sorry, the stages, I should say, of building a test. And I've actually put them back to front because I was using this before as a kind of interactive task for my trainees. But if you look at G, the first thing to do is identify why you need a test. Then you need to identify the users of that test. You go through a design phase, you write samples, you pilot it, you agree specifications then once it's piloted, and then you go and produce the test and monitor it. In other words, it's a very complicated process, well beyond the scope of even an institution, certainly not a teacher. That's why it's lovely that we have these institutions that we can go to look at standardized testing at the different levels. So some of the ones that I've interacted with quite a lot are the ISEs from Trinity, the skills-based tests. You can test your speaking, your reading, your writing, your listening in an interactive way. It's built around an interview and a written test. What I like about it, it's quite like the TIE exam in Ireland as well, the test of interactive English. What I like about it is that the students bring their own material to the test. So that's a beautiful reverse of what usually happens. You usually go along to do your IELTS test and you don't know if the topic is going to be about, you know, insects or, I don't know, the planets or household objects. You just don't know what it's going to be about. If you go along to the ISE Trinity exam or the TIE exam, you are bringing along work that you have prepared. Therefore, you are feeling more confident that you can interact about these things. You talk about yourself, you talk about investigations you've done, you talk about, there are interactive tasks where you have to interact with other candidates or with the examiner. So in my opinion, that's a much better scenario for a student to go into as a test. You know, it's not on the page, it's with humans. It's with more, I like it when it's with more than one, like the examiner is usually an older person. So if the student is there with another student, there's much more chance of them enjoying the experience. In the TIE exam, the final activity is in a group and you have to reach a decision about some criteria they give you. They give you a scenario and you have to reach a decision together. As a TIE examiner, I always felt that the first 4 tasks were relatively successful, but the one that really worked was the last one where the students were all talking to each other. Because the moment they start talking about their real life, they forget it's a test and they start really interacting. So
Ian, do you think there's ways of bringing the things that you value in a test into the classroom for teachers to do quite easily? Is that your
So that's what I'm going to end the last 10 minutes just talking about those things. So on the left there, I'm showing you a test that we all have seen 100 times. It's a single item thing, you know, say grammar or vocabulary test. Those kind of things, personally, I think are controlled practice. They could be done at home for homework or something. They aren't going to make your students feel like test day is an interesting day. In the middle, I randomly from English File, because that's the book that we use, I took the first reading I found within the testing system. And actually, I ended up reading it with interest. It's about Stoics and how the Stoic system is still relevant, say, to today's world. So I read the thing just for interest. and then had a look at the questions. In my opinion, okay, it's a reading that then you look at in the writing how it applies to today's world. But isn't that much more interesting than doing a sort of grammar single item test? Even, you know, I just randomly took that from the book as the first skills-based test I found. So what I'm saying is your testing can go on in the middle of a communicative activity, whether that be reading, writing, listening, or speaking. On the right there's a teacher, and she's doing a communicative activity speaking, but she has a little rubric where she can sort of, as her students do the communicative activity, she can focus in on one or two of them and actually give them feedback on how they're doing on the criteria that she has in front of her. So how is their fluency? How is their accuracy? How's their range, for example, for vocabulary? How's their pronunciation, etc., etc. You know, so once you have the tools, I think you can actually do this within your communicative activities in the classroom. Another thing I'd mention about, if you have a test day, let's imagine for the sake of argument that it's Friday, that test might take, in my opinion, once it goes over about 45 minutes, it's a very long test. So if you do have a 45-minute test, well, the other 45 minutes of that class should be something communicative, interactive, collaborative, so that they don't feel like the whole hour was, you know, one dynamic. It's probably the number one thing I would say about testing and teaching is the dynamic needs to change because different people have different needs within the class. They don't all want to do one thing for the duration of the class. So change the dynamic. When you're doing a test, do something exciting and communicative afterwards.
Ian, we've got 10 minutes left. I just want to say a quick thing about questions. There's lots of questions coming in for you. I know we won't have time to answer everything. So just for anyone who's written a question, I think Ian is actually dealing with quite a lot of them. So if we don't answer your question directly, it may be that he's going to mention it or he already has. So do watch the recording again. There may be something that he's covered. But yes, Ian, if we do have any time for some final questions, that'd be great, because this is a
do you want to mention, I'm going to just talk about a class that I had previously, but it's actually quite an opportune time maybe to do one or two questions.
Gosh, there's quite a few, so I haven't lined them up.
Are people more interested in testing within the classroom or on an institute?
Yes, I think it's generally within the classroom, but it's things like let's see. The Q&A is being used here. Somebody is asking in the chat, and there's quite a few things here in the Q&A. Okay. Yeah. But sorry, Ian, I'm not prepared. You keep going, and I'll come back to it, because then
I'll move on, and then you can ask the questions.
Yeah.
So I just took as an example a class I had. This was just at the beginning. This class coincided with the pandemic happening. It was a class of mainly South American students, not in my school. It was in a different school, and I was the teacher there with them for about 3 months. And what I loved about them, number one, was they had a very low level of English. So at the end of the course, they were A2 plus. They did they went from A2 to A2 plus. So they were struggling, and they were also living in the country. They were working. And they were studying. So I needed to make the course as relevant to their life as possible, and I needed to make the tests fun. So as I mentioned to you before, one of the things that I really appreciated when I was a student was getting some tutorials, some individual attention from the teacher. So what I tried to do was, when they were doing a test, I would also be trying to talk to one or two of them, so that they knew how they were doing overall. One of the ways we made testing more fun was to use things like Kahoots. You probably know that app. And then there's Quizlet, which is very useful and very English language teaching focused. There's a range of apps. I've put them down there on the right, things like Quizzes and Gym Kit, etc. but all of them are the same or similar in that they allow you to put the items of your test into a competitive, fun environment where you've got visuals, you've got background noises and music to make it a little bit more interactive and a bit of fun. So I think the competitive edge is really useful within testing because it gets them emotionally involved and they begin to forget that they're doing a test. One of the things I like to do every day is do a little vocabulary test because I think vocabulary really takes a lot of recycling for them to feel comfortable using it. So I used to do this very simple game. You've all heard of it, X's and O's. So in a blank X's and O's box, I would introduce the 9 items that we learned yesterday. And as the week progressed, we'd recycle the same items. Obviously, each day we were learning new ones, but I will give them more information. So at the beginning of the week, I give them the word. But on the second day, maybe I give them a definition that they have to tell me the word. And by the end of the week, I might just give them the first letter and a clue, and they'd have to give me the word. So the point was that they had to come up with 3 in a row, you know, X's or O's, that game. So very simple, but I would always divide them into one side of the class. It could be boys against girls or left against right. It didn't really matter. Keep the same teams, because at the end of the day, I used to have a little trophy that they would have. So if they won it that day, they keep it on their side of the classroom. And the next day, the idea was that that other team has to try and get the trophy to the other side of the classroom by hook or by crook. So what I liked about that was I could recycle the same words, the same game, but I could focus on different things each day. So tomorrow, it could be the pronunciation of the words that I was going to focus on. Or it could be the meaning of the words, or it could be the collocation with the words. So what words go with these words? You know, so I could build up their store of knowledge, but to them, it was the same words and it was the same game. So they were familiar with the context, but the X factor was the new vocabulary each day. So I'm a big advocate of the likes of Quizlet and Kahoots, etc., because students forget that they're doing a test. They're really either in a competition or not. So just to show you, on this class, we had, I think, 15 people in the class. Of course, at the back of the class, you had the typical students who maybe weren't as committed as the other students. But I used to find that sometimes they'd surprise me. So the board in the middle is a Kahoots that I had engineered so that the weak students might get the answers. And what we ended up with was the least strong student in the class, and he scored the first 500 points. So they like, it's 2 years later, they still text me and send me messages about that day that Lucas actually, you know, won the test. So those kind of things, you know, they help students, even if they're not making much progress, to feel that, you know, it's fun and this is not a test. This is, you know, more interactive and more emotionally involved.
Okay, so Ian, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I think you're redefining testing to a point where a lot of the questions just aren't even relevant, because it's just, it depends, as in it depends, you know, if testing is this kind of thing, and this is motivating for the students and it has the positive washback, then it means that, you know, this can be done with all different kinds of levels of students in the same class, and this can be done at different points during the week. And so I think it's,
I was going to say that I'm a big advocate. Personally, I'm a big advocate of projects. And the reason I think projects are so good, number one is they involve that reflection on learning. But number two is, you know, they can be tested on on what they're learning in a kind of way that it's coming from the students. So on the right there, yeah, just to round this up, on the right there, one of the things they have to do for their test is introduce themselves. This is at a low level now. Introduce themselves and their experience in Ireland. So what I got them to do was do a project where they had to introduce their partner and their experience over the 6 months in Ireland. And then in this case, we made posters, we put the posters on the wall. And the nice thing about that was they had to recycle the English, because they could see, you know, the 12 or 15 posters around the room. So actually making a positive of the test that they've done by, you know, displaying it either on social media or on the walls of the classroom. I think, again, that's a nice washback that they might have.
So I think the key question then here is about keeping records, therefore, of their progress. So if progress is done in this way, how is it that you can really evidence it and quantify it?
Good and good questions. What we use is guided e-learning, so we can put in the daily and weekly scores that we assign into guided e-learning, and it'll tell us then, you know, whether students did the test, what they scored. So the teacher does have to administer, you know, the marks into the system, but it's very easy for them to do on an app. So that's how we do it.
Or if you're doing continuous testing, say, giving students feedback on their speaking while other students are doing a speaking activity, how do you quantify that? Or are you not really quantifying, you're more looking at a holistic view of their progress?
Correct. So what we do within, if we were using that rubric of, say, speaking, you might have 5 criteria. So what we do is we look at the level that they're meant to be at, so the B1 level, right? For example, and we put in there what we feel. So do we feel that was B1, B1 plus, B2? So we put in like the variations around the level that, so we know over time whether they're strong in that skill or weak in that skill, according to the base level in the class.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's a different, I agree, it's a different way of recording
Right. So yeah, so I think there's so many, well, there's a lot to think about here, and so I'm really sorry to everybody that I haven't been able to go through every one of the questions. I think what I've got is that people are coming from very, very different, all different diverse learning situations, teaching and learning situations, and therefore I think Ian's probably not able to say what would you do in this situation and that one, because you're talking from your situation. But the key thing is that the way that you test in your school should relate to your school.
Test what you're teaching, and test it in the same way as you're teaching it. Don't suddenly go to, you know, single item grammar test when you're doing a communicative language course. That's my message. But that's the same for if you're testing, as I said earlier, maybe it is learner training that's part of your course. Of course, you know, that's part of then the test. So test what you're teaching.
Well, if it's okay with you, Ian, I think we need to finish there because we're just over the hour. Were there any final things that you wanted to mention before
I suppose my overall message is bring variety and bring emotional involvement into the testing, just as you would into your teaching.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So next month, everybody, we have got a session on sustainability, bringing sustainability into ELT. Are we doing enough? And the speaker is Christopher Graham, so please join us for that one.